All right, so today we're going to be looking at some pretty complex ideas.
Yeah.
You've given us this really interesting mix of stuff to work with. We've got Terence McKenna talking about how the universe just can't stop making things more and more complex. And then you've got these deep dives into the meta crisis from guys like uh, John Vervaeke, Ian McGilchrist, Daniel Schmachtenberger.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
It is.
But I think there's some really interesting connections between these two seemingly disparate
Eh,
areas.
Second one.
So on the one hand, you have McKenna, back in the 90s, talking about this inherent tendency in the universe towards complexity.
Right.
From the Big Bang on, you start with these simple particles, and then they form atoms, and then stars and galaxies and planets, and then on at least one of those planets, you get life.
Right.
And then that life keeps getting more complex until you have, us humans sitting here.
Yeah, and not just humans,
So-
but also things like language and technology.
Exactly. And it feels like it's speeding up, right? Like the
Yeah.
pace of change is accelerating.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Like, we didn't see the world end in 2012, like McKenna sort of predicted.
Right.
But there is this feeling like things are changing faster and faster.
Yeah, and that's where the meta crisis comes in, I think.
Okay.
Because the meta crisis is all about how our ability to create new technologies has completely outstripped our wisdom in how to use them responsibly.
So we've got like nuclear weapons and climate change and artificial
So with
intelligence.
all these things that are the result of this accelerating complexity that McKenna was talking about.
And they present like existential risks.
Yeah, exactly.
So is this it then? Are we just doomed to be swept along by these forces like a leaf in a hurricane?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And that's where it gets really interesting to look at these sources together.
Okay.
Because McKenna, in his own way, was trying to find a way to break free from these limitations. He thought psychedelics could help us shake things up, see the world differently, kind of like hitting a reset button on our perception. And that idea of a reset button, it kind of resonates with what the metacrisis thinkers are talking about, although they come at it from a different angle.
Okay, so what are they saying?
Well, they're calling for the cultivation of wisdom, particularly the ability to balance what Ian McGilchrist calls the master and emissary functions of our minds.
Okay, hold on. Let's break that down a bit. Who's Ian McGilchrist and what are these master and emissary things?
Okay, so McGilchrist is a neuroscientist, and he's done a lot of work on the differences between the left and right hemispheres of the brain.
Right.
And he argues that the left hemisphere, which he calls the emissary, has become overly dominant in modern society.
Okay.
And the left hemisphere is all about analysis and control and categorization. It's very focused and detail-oriented.
Right, see.
But in doing so, it kind of suppresses the right hemisphere, which he calls the master.
Okay.
And the right hemisphere is more holistic and intuitive. It's connected to the bigger picture.
So the left hemisphere is like the detail guy and the right hemisphere is the big picture guy.
Exactly. And McGilchrist argues that this imbalance, this over-reliance on the left hemisphere's way of seeing the world, is actually contributing to the very problems that make up the meta crisis.
I see, because we become so focused on manipulating and controlling the world around us, optimizing for efficiency and profit, that we've kind of lost sight of what actually gives life meaning and value.
Exactly.
So what's the solution then? How do we shift from this adversarial relationship with the world and maybe even within our own minds to something more balanced, more harmonious?
Well, it's not about getting rid of the left hemisphere altogether. We still need that analytical power, that ability to focus and solve problems, but we need to bring it back into balance with the right hemisphere's perspective.
So it's about integrating both ways of seeing the world,
Exactly.
like finding that sweet spot where logic and intuition work together.
Yes. And one way to think about this is through the lens of opponent processing.
Opponent processing, what's that?
It's a concept borrowed from biology where opposing forces work together to create stability.
Give me an example.
Sure, think about your heart beating. It needs both contraction and expansion to function,
Okay.
or temperature regulation. We need both heating and cooling mechanisms to maintain a stable internal environment.
Right.
In the same way, our minds need both the analytical and the intuitive, the focused and the holistic to function optimally.
Okay, so we need to apply the same principle
Yeah.
to our minds and maybe even to society as a whole.
Exactly. We need to restore that balance between the master and the emissary, between the left and right hemispheres, between the analytical and the intuitive, the focused and the holistic, the individual and the collective. That's how we start to shift from an adversarial to a more harmonious relationship with the world and with ourselves.
I like that. And that raises a really interesting question for you listening. Where do you see this imbalance playing out in your own life, in your work, in the world around you? and what might it look like to shift from adversarial to opponent processing in those areas?
That's a good question. And it's something we're going to explore in more depth as we continue this deep dive.
I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. One of the things that really struck me going through all this material again was the role of language. It comes up again and again, both with McKenna and in the meta-crisis discussions.
Yeah, definitely. Especially with McKenna.
Yeah.
He had some pretty out there ideas about how language shapes our whole experience of reality.
He did. He saw language almost as a technology in a way. Like it's not just something we do naturally.
Right.
It's something we invented, like the wheel or the computer.
Yeah.
And like any technology, it has its benefits, but also its drawbacks.
Right.
And for McKenna, the big drawback of language was that it creates a kind of filter between us and the world.
Like it puts us at a remove from direct experience.
Exactly. It breaks everything down into categories and labels and concepts.
Right.
Which is useful, of course, for communication and all that.
Sure.
But it also limits our perception in a way. It's like we're seeing the world through this grid of language instead of just experiencing it directly.
It's like we're always translating instead of just being...
Right. And this ability of language to shape perception, it's only gotten more powerful with the rise of new technologies.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I mean, think about the 24-hour news cycle, social media, all the algorithms designed to grab our attention. It's a constant barrage of information, all mediated through language.
It's exhausting.
It is, and it's easy to get lost in all that noise, to lose sight of what's actually real and true and meaningful.
Which is why we need wisdom.
Yeah.
Right? That's what the meta-crisis folks keep coming back to.
Exactly. Wisdom is about being able to navigate that information landscape, to discern the signal from the noise.
So it's like we need to develop a kind of media literacy for the 21st century.
Yes, exactly.
Wow.
We need to be able to recognize when we're being manipulated, to question assumptions, to think critically and independently.
But how do we do that? I mean, are we all supposed to become philosophers, constantly questioning every word we hear?
Well, maybe not quite that extreme.
Okay.
But we do need to cultivate a healthy skepticism, a willingness to look deeper, to not just accept things at face value.
So like question the narratives that are being fed to us.
Exactly. Question the media, the advertising, the political discourse, all of it.
It's like we need to develop some kind of mental immune system to protect ourselves from all the BS.
I love that analogy, the mental immune system.
Right, because there's so much information pollution out there.
There is, and that's where that balance between the left and right hemispheres comes in again.
Okay, how so?
Well, that critical thinking, that ability to question and analyze, that's the left hemisphere at work.
Right.
But we also need the right hemisphere's intuition, its ability to see patterns and connect the dots to help us navigate this complex information landscape.
So it's like we need both the microscope and the wide-angle lens
Exactly.
to really get a clear picture of what's going on.
And in a world of accelerating change, that ability to make sense of information, to sift through all the noise and find the signal that's more important than ever.
You know, it's funny, McKenna talked about this too, even though the internet was barely a thing when he was writing. Yeah, he talked about how communication was evolving faster and faster, pushing us towards a world of greater visual immediacy.
And he was right. We've gone from text to images to video to virtual reality, and who knows what's next.
It's mind-boggling.
It is, and it's easy to lose ourselves in all that, to lose touch with the real, the tangible, the things that actually matter.
Which brings us back to that need for a re-engagement with direct experience.
Yes, exactly. McKenna was exploring that through psychedelics, but the meta-crisis thinkers are talking about other paths like meditation, mindfulness, spending time in nature.
Practices that help us get out of our heads and into our bodies.
Exactly. It's about cultivating what some call ecological awareness, a sensitivity to the interconnectedness of all things.
So it's not just an intellectual understanding.
No, it has to be embodied, felt, lived.
And that connects back to what we were talking about earlier, right? Shifting from an adversarial relationship with the world to something more harmonious, more collaborative.
Absolutely, because if we see ourselves as separate from nature, as masters of the universe, then we're going to keep exploiting and abusing it.
But if we recognize that we're part of that web of life,
then we're more likely to act with respect and humility and responsibility.
So we've got language, technology, consciousness, all these threads weaving together in this tapestry of accelerating change.
And they're all pointing to this need for a fundamental shift in perspective.
A reevaluation of our values, our priorities, how we live our lives.
It's a tall order, no doubt, but it's also incredibly hopeful because in the midst of all this chaos and uncertainty, we're being called to something greater.
to something wiser, something more aligned with the true nature of reality.
McKenna talked about becoming novelty conservators, not just passive observers of change, but active participants in the unfolding of something truly extraordinary.
And that's really what this whole deep dive is about, isn't it? It's not just about understanding these forces, but about recognizing our own agency within them.
Exactly. We have a choice even in the face of accelerating change.
We can choose to be swept along, or we can choose to become conscious co-creators of the future.
And that choice ultimately begins with each one of us.
It begins with asking ourselves, what kind of future do we want to create, and what are we willing to do to become in order to bring that future into being?
Those are great questions to sit with, but how do we move from pondering to action? What are the concrete steps we can take to cultivate wisdom, to navigate this accelerating change, and to create a future that's both meaningful and sustainable?
Yeah, that's what I want to know.
Well, that's where things get really interesting, and that's what we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive.
All right, so we've talked about accelerating change and the meta crisis and all that, but
Mhm.
how do we actually put all this into practice? How do we actually live in this world and try to make a better future?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, there's no easy answer. But I do think these sources we've been talking about, they give us some clues, some guiding principles.
Okay, so what are they? What are these guiding principles?
Well, I think one of the most important ones is rediscovering a sense of reverence.
Reverence.
Yeah, not necessarily for like a god or anything like that, but just for life itself. You know, for the incredible complexity and beauty and interconnectedness of it all, for the sheer mystery of the universe.
That was a big thing for McKenna, wasn't it? He was always talking about the universe as this novelty-conserving engine.
He was. And I think that sense of awe and wonder, it's so important, especially when we're talking about something as heavy as the meta crisis.
Right.
It's easy to get caught up in fear and despair.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But if we can cultivate that sense of reverence, it can be a real antidote to that. It can help us see the world differently.
Like not just as something to be exploited and controlled.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're part of something much bigger than ourselves.
And that our actions have consequences.
Yes. And that's a crucial shift in perspective if we're going to navigate these challenges we're facing.
Because the old ways of thinking, the ways of extraction and exploitation and endless growth, those ways are leading us straight to disaster.
Yeah, we need a new story, a new way of being in the world.
Okay, so how do we start writing that new story? Where do we even begin?
I think it starts with each one of us, with cultivating awareness, with challenging our assumptions,
Okay.
with asking ourselves, what is my role in all of this? How can I contribute to a more beautiful, more sustainable future?
McKenna talked about the need to become free people.
Yeah.
Individuals who don't depend on institutions or ideologies or external authorities for their sense of meaning and purpose.
And that freedom, that self-reliance, it's not about isolating ourselves. It's about becoming more deeply connected to ourselves, to each other, to the natural world.
It's about recognizing that we have a choice.
Exactly. We can choose to be swept along by the current, or we can choose to become conscious co-creators of a wiser future.
And that choice, it's not just some abstract idea. It's something we're doing every day.
Right.
Every thought, every action, every purchase, every vote.
Exactly. It's all connected.
So it all comes back to wisdom.
It does.
Not just knowledge, but the ability to use that knowledge wisely.
Yeah. It's about seeing the bigger picture, thinking long-term, balancing the needs of the individual with the needs of the collective.
And it's a journey that requires both head and heart,
It does.
both the analytical and the intuitive.
Exactly. We need both.
It's about integrating all the different parts of ourselves.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And it's not an easy journey by any means.
No?
It takes courage and commitment and a willingness to really look at ourselves honestly.
But it's a journey worth taking.
Absolutely. Because
Yeah.
the stakes are higher than ever.
We're living at a time of such incredible change.
Yeah.
Both terrifying and exciting at the same time.
It's almost overwhelming, isn't it?
It is. But we don't have to figure it all out on our own.
That's right. We can draw strength and inspiration from each other, from the wisdom traditions that have been passed down for generations, from the natural world. We can lean into the mystery, embrace the unknown, and trust that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope. There's always a spark of possibility waiting to be ignited.
That's a beautiful thought. I love that. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think we should leave our listeners with a question to ponder.
Oh, I like that. What question?
What does it mean to live a wise and meaningful life in this age of accelerating change? What kind of future are you called to create? And what steps can you take starting today to embody the wisdom, the courage, the compassion that this moment in history demands.
Beautiful. I hope this deep dive has sparked some new ideas for our
Me
listeners.
too. I hope it's given them some things to think about and maybe even inspire them to take action.
Because ultimately, the real work, the real transformation happens out there in the world in each of our lives.
So go forth, explore, experiment, and above all, be bold.
The future is unwritten. It's up to us to write it.